First and foremost, thank you for having me here. I'm happy to be here today. And I must warn you, I have the tendency to speak a lot, and I'm fully capable of speaking more than 35 minutes, so I'm going to keep track of time here, and I'll try to keep myself short. So a few words about inspiration and about how I came to inspiration, because in this context, I think it's relatively important. And Inspiration, we're a young organization, and we strive to not only use art as a catalyst for social and sustainable and positive social change, but more importantly, what we're trying to do is to look at what is happening already. We work with multipliers, we work with artists, and we work with researchers and scholars. Now, what we're trying to do is not only do work in the sense of do projects, but also to look into the processes that lay behind it. And we want to understand what is happening to the people that we're working with, but also what is happening to the art forms that are used in the context. So today I'm going to speak about women empowerment through artistic practices, which is a practice that is very, very common in Uganda. Uganda, a country in East Africa, is currently the focus of our work at Inspiration. And so with everything that I'm going to say, I'm going to mainly focus on Uganda, though some parts, especially when it comes to theory, are applicable to other countries, especially countries in the global south, and I'm going to get into that in a little bit. Also, and I want to mention this right now, what I'm going to be speaking about is obviously limited and not generalizable, which means I don't want to speak in ultimate terms. And everything that I'm going to say obviously is heavily influenced by my personal opinion. I can't take myself out of that. And it's also always a representation of the projects that I see and the projects that we have evaluated. So I thought a bit about how to sort of put this presentation together. And I know that you're very familiar with cultural diplomacy and potentially also art and cultural diplomacy. I wasn't sure about how much background you have on art and international development, which is related, but obviously not the same. So I want to speak a bit about the emergence and how art came to be a part of international development agendas. I want to speak about the advantages that especially the initiators who brought art to international development saw in it. I also want to speak about funding, because funding is a very, very important aspect. And that automatically also leads me towards the critique. I want to then briefly focus on women empowerment. Before I want to present to you a couple of actual projects, and then hopefully we'll have an interesting discussion at the end about everything. If you have questions in between, feel free to interrupt me and to ask. Okay, so in order to understand how art came to be and found its way and place in international development, and accordingly what stimulated the sort of, in parentheses, change in the development paradigm, I think it is worthwhile to look into the history of the development work. And looking at art always also means looking at culture. Culture, just like so many other terms that we use in our daily lives and whereabouts, has many definitions. And usually we have, slight different understandings and notions of the same word that we're using. And so in order to clarify that, I will adopt the definition of culture that was proposed by Radcliffe, and I quote, "The material products, patterns of social relations, and structures of feelings produced by multiple actors who are differentially positioned in power relations, political, economic, and social reproduction." That is her proposition for a definition of culture. So in this definition, culture is constructed as a dynamic concept, which I think is very important to always emphasize on the fact that culture is ever changing. And importantly, it also includes the power aspect into its definition. In addition, Stoppels, who is a researcher and one of the experts in the field of art and international development, has emphasized the importance to also add that culture also always means that there is a shared understanding within communities, nations, or social groups about a status quo and about norms. So according to this definition, the one that you see over there, culture itself does not necessarily exist in material objects, but art and artistic practices can be positioned within a cultural setting and therefore constructed as culturally important. So as I said before, I don't think we can speak about art without speaking about culture. That is the first reason for why I'm mentioning culture here. And secondly, because it was through the so-called cultural turn in international development that art became to be introduced and implemented as a methodology in development work. So what is the cultural turn? Development and development efforts were established after the independence of many formerly colonialized countries. And until around the early mid-1980s, development meant almost exclusively economic development. So one wanted to help countries to develop economically, to develop industrial sectors, and to emphasize and focus on trade. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, however, there was a change in that. There was a change in culture as a concept or as a methodology was sort of introduced to development. And there are at least 5 reasons for that. I'm going to skim through them just very briefly. The first one was obviously related to the evaluation of work that was been done in the development context. And this evaluation led towards the conclusion that development did not really work. So people started to ask questions. What went wrong and why did it? And one of the conclusions was the lack of culturally adapted methods and programs, which means the thought behind it was if we were to adapt the programs that we have, if we don't assume that there is one unitarian model that can be applied everywhere, but that we have one model and we need to modify it so that it fits the need of the target population we're working with or the culture, then it would be much more successful. At the same time, the dominance of certain cultures in the world and through their expansion through development efforts, what one could see was that marginalized cultures were threatened to be extinct. So one became aware of this and wanted to work against it, which is another factor that played into the emergence of the cultural turn in development. Also, and this is very important, by the 1980s, both feminist theories and post-colonial theories had been established, and with it, the critical thinking of the critical theories. And with that also came a question of what actually are we doing in development? What is development? How do we define development? What are power structures within development? What influence does gender have and gender roles, and also the heritage of colonialism. So all of that played into this as well. Fourth, it was seen that globalism accelerated, and this was sort of a counter move towards the acceleration of globalism. And lastly, and I'm not going to say anything else about this because I'm not super familiar with development in Eastern Asia. I wrote East Africa, that's why I'm confused right now. But because of the development successes in East Africa, now I said it again, East Asia, a lot of questions were raised regarding development on the African continent, and one was wondering, what did they do that we did not do, or what did they do differently? And again, one found culture to be an important aspect and asset towards this. So, generally speaking, there are 4 approaches to the cultural turn, and they're obviously related also towards the key factors that drove the cultural turn. One is termed self-reflexivity. I can't pronounce this. Self-reflexivity. There we are. And self-reflexivity refers to critically assess also where you are coming from. In this sense, with you, I mean the funders and the driving agencies of development work. What are the own cultural underpinnings that sort of find their way into the development agendas? And what are the norms and values that are placed upon the definitions of development? The second main approach was focusing on the effectiveness of development, which is something that I've referred to on the previous slide as well. And here it was mainly to understand the local cultures and adapt development programs accordingly in order to effectively do development work. And then, of course, there was the economic potential of culture. When we look, for instance, at contemporary Australian culture, what we see is that they've established a number of sort of indigenous and aboriginal camps where you can go and visit and become part of the aboriginal culture, including clothing, including learning how to throw a boomerang. I'm not going to go into the ethics of that, but this is one of the approaches that was seen, and one of the advantages that was perceived of the cultural turn in development. And of course, there is the potential of marketing artifacts, art products, and material objects that are indigenous to cultures and may be understood and perceived as souvenirs or as beautiful items to be placed in homes by others, and therefore a potential for economic growth. The last one is an approach in which art was seen, or culture, the use of culture in development, as a source for political activism, to bring about social change, to sort of use soft power approaches to transform societies. At this point, maybe it sounds like it, the way I'm presenting it, but the cultural turn was not a mainstream notion within development efforts at the time. It was sort of, a niche product that has grown since, but still it's highly debated and it's very controversial. As you all know, and most of you probably much better than myself, you know the UNESCO, and you know that it is the UN institution in charge for education, science, and culture. In its formation and vision until this day are very closely linked to Chapter 9, and in Chapter 9, Article 55 of the UN Charter, which states that with a view of the creation and conditions of stability and well-being which are necessary for peaceful and friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, the UN nations shall promote, and I'm going to skip the next one, and get to be, solutions of international economic, social, health, and related problems, and international cultural and educational cooperation. Which means that UNESCO was founded on the belief that peace can only be founded and advanced through, among other things, educational and cultural relations. And art, in its various forms, as positioned within a cultural setting and constructed as culturally important, is often perceived and understood as a manifestation of culture. Manifestation in the sense that through art, many cultural understandings, norms and values are made visible, and with being made visible, they're also being made concrete. The UNESCO is until this day one of the key drivers of promoting cultural diversity and one of the largest funding institutions of cultural development projects. Since the late 1970s, it increased its attention towards indigenous development. And this should not come as a surprise. In 1988, it pronounced the World Decade for Cultural Development. This lasted for a decade, and you can see the logo. It's relatively small, I'm sorry about that. It looked bigger on my screen. But this is a logo which is interesting to look at because you can see 5 faces. I don't know whether you can see them, but they're there. And they were designed by a Swiss artist called Hans Erni. And the idea of this logo was, in his words, to have the 5 faces from the 5 continents of the earth, symbolizing the manifold creativity and the social and cultural life. The decade of cultural development was proclaimed in order to encourage countries to reflect, to adopt policies, and to undertake activities to ensure the integrated development of their societies. So we spoke a bit about the cultural turn, and the cultural turn was the sort of main drive, or the key motor that brought art into the international development arena. And one of the major advantages of art in international development efforts is the so-called agency of art. And whenever in this context it is referred to art as agency, one refers to the work of Alfred Gell, who wrote a book with the same title. And he proposed the theory of art as agency that is neither based on aesthetics nor on visual communication. It is defined by the distinctive function it performs in advancing social relationships through the abduction of agency. Which means art here is not looked at or valued for its aesthetic value, but for the social aspect that it also carries in its ability to transform societies. If agency is prioritized, then the subject becomes central. And if the subject becomes central, then we see a movement from the macrostructures towards microstructures, which means the target population, or the subject, the final beneficiary, as we call them many times, becomes the central focus of the work. And from looking at it, very locally, and focused, that is where we grow, as opposed to, entering the structure and bringing the structure and implementing that time and time again. So art does that. Art looks at the subject and offers the subjects to participate, become part of the process, and make the process participatory. Rightfully so, art highlights the capacities of individuals. It makes visible, and here comes the art therapist inside of me. It gives a voice to those who cannot verbalize their agendas for whatever reasons. Many times when we're dealing with issues in international development, we're also dealing with issues on the societal level, on the cultural level, on health aspects, and there are many, many taboos involved with that. There are many societal borders that cannot be crossed, at least not verbally. So art offers an opportunity to enter and address aspects that many times we can't otherwise speak about. Instead of positioning recipients of aid as passive and dependent, it allows for them to tell their stories, thereby avoiding to fall into the trap of the single story. And I'm sure that you've all heard about the dangers of a single story, where you have a single narrative, and then you build your whole perception and picture around that single narrative. One additionally particularly positive asset of art in international development is its imaginative capacity. Because art does not only display what is, but also what can be. And it creates visions, and through those visions, it can stimulate the formulation of goals and the idea of a better reality, however that may look like. Lastly, it resists a reductionist approach and understands the target population as individuals who have needs beyond the first two levels of Maslow's infamous pyramid of needs. And it understands that also people who are poor may have the need and the desire to experience art in its various forms. And of course, it can lead towards economic growth, the growth of creativity and innovation. Now, as I said before, when we speak about art and international development, we cannot not speak about the funding of art and international development. Because as it comes with many advantages, it also comes with many dependencies. And until this day, as I said before, art and culture, or the notion of the importance of art and culture in development, are not mainstream. However, through the past decades, and this is mainly because of the cultural turn and then the work of the UNESCO, more mainstream development organizations have started to integrate art into their programs. Thereby, it does raise questions, though, about which approach one is referring to. And very many times we will see that the economic approach is the dominant one. So I'm going to quote, "As financial institutions, such as the Inter-American Development Bank, begin to consider ways of unlocking the economic, educational, and social power of culture, questions such as the following need to be addressed. What are the benefits of investing in culture? In what spirit and in what sorts of cultural endeavors should investments be made? What rationales and what policies would best support the integration of culture in the development agenda?" This is a quote from the UNESCO from 1999. According to Stoppels, whom I've quoted earlier, this discourse is neither reflective nor does it challenge the development paradigm that ultimately and strongly emphasizes the economic development. So we see that there is a constant struggle, and the constant struggle is very much visible through the funding of art programs in international development. I forgot one important aspect, which is the very last one. Because even though UNESCO early on emphasized on the importance of culture in international development, art as a visualized component was not necessarily on their agenda at the time. This is something that especially Dr. Ingrid Eide, who was the president of the Norwegian National Commission for UNESCO, noticed. And she initiated the establishment of a program called Artisan Development, which was, as far as I know, the first of its kind. The aim of the AID was to offer workshops in the Global South. Target populations were local artists and artisans or craftsmen. It began to operate in the late 1990s and had several objectives. The first one was to strengthen cultural diversity, much as we see in the goals of the UNESCO. It was countering asymmetries in the cultural process of globalization, which again highlights the process or processual nature of culture. And this, wait, I'm losing myself. Okay. And this is an aspect that is many times overlooked, I feel, when we talk about culture, really the dynamic aspect of it. We tend to overlook the driving forces and the aim that there is always a specific cultural paradigm that drives development. And so because it has been developed in a specific cultural setting, it only represents certain populations and certain goals of certain populations. Another objective was the improvement of the technical capabilities in order for the artists to become more competitive and, again, income generating. Okay. This tells me I have 8. I'll try. Okay, so I'm just going to skip through this one. Another aspect that's important to look at when it comes to the funding of cultural projects, artistic projects in international development is that former colonial powers tend to fund projects in their former colonies. That is one. Cultural institutions, I'm not going to go into them. We all know them, and they're a topic in themselves. Naturally, because many times they're funded by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of their respective countries, they also have, obviously, an interest in promoting their own culture. There's going to be a cultural exchange, but there is always a question of power, because generally speaking, the funding agency is the one that holds more power. NGOs many times to this day use art as a tool. Many times they're social work oriented and a set to additional programs that they run on the side. So it's like sort of like a cherry on top of the pie, if you want to say it that way. Many times, however, funding is limited to a certain amount of time. And this is something that we need to bear in mind and we need to consider when speaking about art in international development, because it always comes with the questions, what happens when the funding runs out, and how is this project going to continue, if at all? because of the time, I'm not going to read the whole quote, but it's a beautiful quote. You can Google it. It's from an interview with Mbembe from 2009. If you type in Mbembe 2009, you're going to find the interview. Pictures taken? Okay. The main critique of Mbembe in this interview is that he says that the value of art is almost exclusively economically oriented. And I understand his citation almost as a cry for art's sake, which is, you know, the very famous quote that we all know and we all keep hearing in similar discussions around the subject matter. Again, the limited funding is definitely something that we need to take into consideration. What happens when funding runs out? There is a beautiful example of an organization called In Movement that used to operate in Uganda. It did a lot of artistic projects around dance, theater, and music with children, but then the sponsors pulled out and they had to close the doors, which means obviously we can argue that there are benefits and the children who participated in it benefited, but then to what extent do such programs have an impact if they cannot continue to operate? Also, there is a limited perception of the material cultural heritage of the countries or the art products that are many times produced in such development projects. Many times they're taken home as souvenirs and they're not purchased as art. They may be purchased as a craft or as a souvenir. But we need to take into consideration that we're talking about indigenous art forms many times. That something that we claim to be primitive art is for others and for other cultures and societies linked to a tradition that has lasted many hundred, if not thousands of years. And we need to ask ourselves the question whether for the sake of empowerment, we want to use and potentially destroy this cultural heritage. And this is something that we cannot, for as long as funding comes from the West or the global North, cannot take out of the equation, is that there is always the question of whether, at the end of the day, art and international development and funding of culture is not a form of neocolonialism in which we bring culture after we've brought you agriculture. I do wanted to speak about women empowerment, but I do want to speak about the examples that I brought, so I'm going to skip this, and I'm very sorry about it. So this project that I'm presenting to you, and this is just a sculpture made by the artist. This is an artist, her name is Lilian Nabulime. She's a Ugandan artist and focused on HIV and AIDS awareness in her artwork. What we can see here is a sculpture that she made from wood, and the baskets that you don't see very well, but she calls them everyday objects. Many times there are beads, there are rocks, there are other items of everyday use that have a cultural representation. They have a meaning to the target population. And the basket forms is to represent the wombs of a woman. So she's actually addressing through her artwork the danger of HIV and AIDS infection. This is Nabulime, and you can see the little sculptures. The little sculptures are made from soap. And in a project that she did, and you can see it here, they do look like genitals with a purpose. And the beans and the stones that you can see here are representations of infected people, of people who are severely sick, where the virus has broken out. And then we can also see completely transparent soap sculptures where there's nothing inside. And as I said before, because we're talking about HIV awareness and we're talking about a very sensitive topic, so just verbally talking about it is very, very difficult. And in the past, Uganda has, until this day, unfortunately, a very high prevalence of HIV/AIDS. So it is very important to raise awareness among the population and to speak about it. But how do you speak about it when you can't speak about it? So this is what Lilian Nabulime did with her work. And by playing with it, the people could immediately relate to what it is that they were seeing. And because they were talking about art materials and they were playing with it, they weren't talking about themselves. And when it comes to women empowerment, this is one of the most beautiful assets of this project that I personally find is a beautiful example of how art can be used in international development, can be used as culturally sensitive and addressing very important issues. What I find very beautifully is that Uganda traditionally is a culture where it's difficult, even though it's changing, for women to speak up, especially in a society when outside of the home that is very much male-dominated. So in this context, it was possible for the couple to speak together because, again, they weren't speaking about themselves, they were speaking about sculptures. Just one more thing. This project did not obviously have, excuse me, was not money-oriented in the sense. It was socially oriented, and it empowered the populations successfully to the point where this is a model that's now being implemented in various forms in Uganda until this day. I have about 2 more minutes? Okay. Now something, and I want to close with a different example, just to sort of see, show you the amount of different projects that are out there and how they're, even though the majority of them are established from very, very good intentions, but not always successfully so. I don't know whether you can see this, but we're seeing a map, and the majority of the locations indicated on this map are in the Global South. And I don't think you can see this, but those are the names of collections, of jewelry collections. And we have names such as Hope Collection, we have the Peace Collection, we have the, I think somewhere we have the Reconciliation Collection as well. So what is this project? The Ugandan version of it is called the Dignity Collection. And we can see a woman who's placed, and basically the notion that we get from looking at this is that this project is giving dignity to the people. And it does so by letting them make jewelry. And even though it's beautiful jewelry, and we see this kind of jewelry all over Uganda, this is jewelry that is designed in the United States and then manufactured in Uganda. And then sold. And I'm being very affirmative, and I'm not being objective here, and I know that. So my apologies. But then this is being sold as empowerment. And of course, the women are presented here as well with a short bio, and it serves as the notion that because of the activity, because of the artistic activity, in this case it's jewelry making, it's the traditional jewelry making that is then adapted and fused with modern technologies and modern beads. But it is traditional jewelry making that we're speaking about. And because of this program that is run and organized by an organization from the United States, that the designs are made in the United States and then manufactured in Uganda, here is women empowerment. So I don't have a summary yet. I'm going to skip Uganda Crafts 2000 Limited. I wanted to bring it because it focuses not on jewelry. Many times when we speak about women empowerment in Uganda, we speak about jewelry making or basketry. And I'm not going to speak about the hierarchy of art forms because I'm running out of time. But I thank you very much for your attention, and would like to hear questions, discussions, ideas, and comments from your side. Thank you. Yes.
So I'm studying economics and development, so a lot of the things we talked about today were really interesting to me, and I've heard a lot of aspects of university before. I think that it's really important in development today to pay attention to culture because, especially during the colonial era, but also the post-colonial development projects, culture has really been pushed aside or even like forcibly removed from many societies around the world. And so I think that it's really important. I just have like one sort of question because it's kind of about women emancipation and developing regions of the world. And like if the idea and if the project is to develop this kind of niche of women working with art in these regions, just like from an economic perspective, if they're encouraged to work with art, then doesn't that also at the same time in a way kind of discourage them from incorporating themselves in other areas of society? I know that like in Europe a lot of times, or in the United States, there's a lot of talk about how do we get equal representation of women in all fields of work, and also about equal pay. So I'm just thinking like, okay, and with the example of Uganda, if more women are given the economic opportunity of earning money by working in art, and at the same time they're not really being encouraged to work in other areas of society, for example in sciences and education and government. So what do you kind of, I mean, how does your organization see that kind of thing?
Mm-hmm. It's a very good question. Thank you for that. Obviously, it's a very complex issue, and it requires a very complex and long answer that I'm not gonna able to give now. But what happens many times in this kind of project is that, and this is something I didn't really get to, is art is being seen as like an entry step towards participation in society. And because many times those traditional art forms are being used and implemented, they are art forms that were traditionally already women's duties. With the difference that they did it at home and they kept it at home and it wasn't sold. So now what is trying to be done, or what is being done in many times, is the establishment of corporations where women can do the same work outside of the house, and many times that step is already major. And the idea behind it is that once you get women to participate visibly in society, and be it through artistic activity, then the next step will be further down the line and more accessible in that sense. And it brings me back to the question of, you know, what is art being used for here? And is it for the art's sake, for the artistic value, or is it a tool? And many times it is a tool. I'm not saying it's necessarily bad. But yeah, so many times it's seen as like a first step towards integration. Go for it. Yes.
Okay, so it's kind of not entirely related to that question. First of all, thank you for being here. I personally find it very interesting. So you were talking about how art is supposed to be kind of like a bridge to bring people into the social, or to cross social barriers, and you were talking mostly about the less developed countries.
Mm-hmm.
But looking at statistics, I think from the Museum of Modern Art in New York and the Tate Modern in London, we can see that primarily the art that is in those museums is by men, mostly white men. So not a lot of women, even less women of color. And I'm just wondering, what do you think? Like, what does that say about our development, and not even here where women are supposed to be so integrated, and they can't even get to those kind of museums? What does that say about our development?
It's a very good question. Very good question, and it's actually something that I'm frequently thinking about, because also when we look at the theory that we're using, or the majority of the theories that we're using today, we need to think about, who developed those theories. And again, it comes down to white Western men. So I think this is, luckily, it's something that is being increasingly addressed in its various forms. But of course, it's a fact that it always plays into it, and that's why I find the Radcliffe definition of culture so important, because it takes the dynamic and the power aspect into consideration, which I think is very important here. Yes.
Actually, my name is Yara Mwana, and I'm doing my PhD in somehow very similar topic about the role of cultural heritage in peace building up integrated and inclusive societies. If you don't mind, I would like to answer the first question, because part of the case study I'm doing in my PhD is about the role of community archaeology and how much engaging with the cultural experience can change the society somehow. Yes, you're right that in a way it looks like as if the women gonna have one exit to social life, which is art and design. However, if you look at it on a longer term, and when you talk about social change, you need to have very much of patience of looking at the time scale. And that's why, like, if you see the first generation, they were the women doing that. But if you see what's going to happen within the society, I'm talking about villages in northeast Syria, very closed and very isolated somehow, with a lot of lack of development, indicators somehow. However, when you see the second generation, you see that because the women went out of their houses, start to engage with economic development, they changed their social status in the family. And that affected the second generation, the daughters. They all went to universities. That some of them wanted to do the archaeology because they have this big archaeological side, but a lot of them are going to medicine, to technology, to other also other engineering sectors. And like I was looking at the women and men in these villages, who was going where, and to my surprise, it was more women than men, and it wasn't in the first city next to them. They decided to go to Aleppo or to Damascus, which is like really far, the capital, making a huge change in their lives. So when we look at these things, they are only a first step, and actually what happens when you engage with cultural experiences changes your dynamic, changes your culture, changes your opportunities, change your network, and that's part of the empowerment that can move later on within the society. My question to you is what about assessment? Like, did you ever engage within a project, like in the way how much social change did in the future, or how much, in case this change can be assessed, what indicators, what preconditions you have looked at it?
So up until this stage, we have not. But this is something that is in planning, and it's going to mostly not happen anymore this year, but it's in planning for next year to exactly do that. Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yes.
Okay, thanks first for your presentation. It's a very interesting subject. My name is Natalie Samayo. I'm coming from Peru, and I'm a student of Master in International Relations, and my research topic is women empowerment, indigenous women empowerment through cultural products. And I'm doing my research work about Peru, about indigenous women woven textiles. And it's used in Peru that these products very well sell. But the problem is that globalization and new technologies are replacing these products. So I would like to ask you which tools could be implemented in order to not impact negatively to these indigenous communities, because they don't have the education to do by technology or another sort to do these products. They do handmade these textiles. So I think they are very impact negatively, and they don't are mostly women. They are not developing themselves. They are not increasing more economic growth. So yeah.
So my answer to that question can only be partial. But something, because this is a similar, obviously, development that we also see in African countries. Although I can only ever speak about East Africa because that's the only region I know really well. But something that a number of very interesting projects are being done are collaborations between such women groups and artists. And what they do is they sort of bring modernity or contemporaneity to the traditional artworks. And by really, I wish I could show it to you. Maybe I can show it to you later. But what they're doing is that they're using like the traditional craft and the traditional techniques, but they add very unique and modern designs to it. And so it is like it's this traditional cultural object, but it has this very unique style to it. And that is what in this case, so this is mainly focusing on basketry, but that is what has made a change there. I don't know whether similar avenues could work or maybe are already being implemented in Peru as well.
Actually, in the market, the companies, the big companies, they are replacing these products. So
Right, but because those products that you're talking about, they're handmade.
yeah,
Um,
they do it by a machine.
And the other ones are doing them by the machine. So when you do handmade, then you can sort of integrate different aspects
Yeah.
and also different styles into it, make it unique. And by making it unique, you make it outstanding and differ from the
Actually,
manufactured.
it's unique, but the problem I think is the price market. These handmade products are more expensive than imports.
Naturally.
So,
Mhm.
yeah, but it makes a negative impact to these communities because they only source of
There's
economic.
not enough awareness for others to understand their value. So there will
That's
be
right. I
another
think
way.
the government should implement more policies.
I think we're going to do one more question and then thank you though. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Rachel Clark. I worked for 5 years in the mountains and valleys of Southeast Asia with Indigenous women from different Indigenous minorities. And the development happens on different levels at different times. So people living in the villages are seeing that and they're eager to join it, but they don't have the opportunities. So when people like UNESCO and other organizations are organizing their development interventions in these places, they have to take that into consideration and give chances specifically to the talented young women in these villages that have the potential to study and design specific programs that enables them to go to university or to art college, to study the background, to link the design and to take into consideration that places in the United States and companies in the United States are designing and sending the design back. I mean, that's a middle of the road kind of example in terms of innovation is concerned. It's good because it generates income, but it's not good because it's taking the empowerment of actually doing the design themselves away from the people.
Mhm.
So if UNESCO and these other organizations empower individuals who appreciate their own culture, who know the background, and then they become the initiators of change, together with companies, for example, that run these these shops that really place value onto these products. Locally, they're being sold to tourists, and the tourists, if they were aware, they would like ask more about the artist that produced it and start to treat it and start to generate interest in the individual biographies of the artists that are producing it. So we can also do our bit as intelligent, informed consumers to put more emphasis on this as art. But this has to be part of a general overall program that's empowering the artists. But thank you very much also for your contribution, Yara, because this shows how quickly it can also happen. That people from individuals from villages can go straight up to a high educational level and start to make a change. My last comment I wanted to make about that was in the places where I was working as part of the nation building, and this happened in my native country, Scotland too, in the Highlands and also in Canada with the Indigenous people. Basically, they crushed all the art, they banned it, they banned the local languages, they banned the local crafts and all the local cultures in order to get them into a modern economic workforce. This meant they wanted to channel them into projects where they were basically being workers on land for companies
No, thank you very much. I think you made a very important comment, and addition to that, one last thing maybe, something that we do need to take into consideration, obviously, is that our ancestors, and by saying that I mean European ancestors, they destroyed a lot of the local culture and a lot of the local art, and if they didn't destroy it, they took it to our museums many times. And so that is definitely also a factor that needs to be taken into consideration. Thank you very much. I'm sorry it took so much time.